Hello, friends. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos, where we discuss communication with people who are different than you. And since we're all unique, that's pretty much everyone. When someone has a different style of communication, they can seem like a weirdo. And if they seem that way to you, you probably seem that way to them. As I like to say, everyone's kind of a weirdo. We're going to talk about some of the assumptions that we make and other pitfalls of communication so that we can all improve. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Welcome back to How to Talk to Weirdos. I recently interviewed Anna Xavier. She was born in Portugal, and we talked a lot about how when English is your second language, there are words and cultural references which may be unfamiliar and can make communication difficult. That episode airs next week, so you can check that out. But in the meantime, it got me thinking about the fact that even though I was born here and I only really speak English and have all my life, there are still a lot of challenges. There was one time when I had been into a phase where I was reading a bunch of books about space travel, not in the far future, but in the near future where the technology either exists or is close to existing. I read Saturn Run, which was a great book by John Sanford and Katine. I also read Seven Eves by Neil Stephenson. And again, in both cases, they were talking about travel in the near future. And I was immersed in it. It was, between the two books, almost 1,500 pages. And then my wife at the time and I saw that the movie The Martian was on. Also happens to be about traveling through space. So we watched that, and they were traveling, and effectively they figured out that they were going in the wrong direction. Not necessarily the wrong direction, but not the direction they wanted to go to. And she turned and looked at me and said, well, why don't they just turn around? And because I'd been so immersed in it, without even thinking, I said, they don't have enough reaction mass for the delta V. I seriously said that. They don't have enough reaction mass for the delta V. And I thought to myself, man, I sound pretty smart. But then I looked at her, and she was basically just looking at me with a blank face waiting for the real answer, which was, they don't have enough fuel. She said, oh, okay. And then we kept watching. And it gets me realizing that two things can make English sound like a second language: jargon and slang word. I happen to use a lot of jargon at that point because that's what I was immersed in. The other is slang. But jargon is usually found in the business and or working world. In a corporation, you might hear someone say, we have to avoid scope creep. Don't try to boil the ocean. We have to stay laser focused if we want to move the needle on our KPIs. That is a realistic sentence to hear in corporate America. In the show notes, I'm going to explain all of the phrases in there and what they mean. But if everybody is working together in corporate America, that may make perfect sense. But if you try using that sentence with someone in academia, aka a teacher or professor, they might come back with a discussion about how pedagogy can give students agency. So everybody has their own jargon, and you just need to be careful when you're talking outside of your realm that you make things understandable for other people. There are some industries that really are worse than others. For instance, if my doctor ever told me that I have tachycardia and it's idiopathic, I might think I'm dying. And if I heard that, it would probably raise my heart rate to an elevated level. And a raised heart rate is what tachycardia is. But if knowing that is what made my heart, or hearing that sentence is what made my heart rate go up, then it would no longer be idiopathic, because idiopathic means something for which the cause is unknown. So for doctors especially, if they use jargon, then it can be very confusing and scary to the other person. But it's not just doctors, it's most industries have their own. So when you're talking to people within your own industry, it can make you seem, when you're talking to people outside of your industry, it can initially make you seem kind of smart to use those big jargon words, but it's confusing to just about everyone else. And one problem we've talked about on the show before is that most people are not comfortable asking questions when they don't understand something. So be careful about using jargon. Just because people don't ask you what it means doesn't mean that they actually understand you. And don't get me wrong, when you are dealing with people from your own industry, jargon can make perfect sense. It's often the most efficient way to very accurately describe something that might be pretty complicated. When you're talking to someone outside of your field, it's usually not that much harder to explain it in a way that makes sense to the other people. It may not be quite as precise, but would you rather have people understand 90% of something that's really close to exactly what you mean, or 0% of something that is 100% precisely accurate? I'd go with as much understanding as I can get. In addition to jargon, slang can get pretty confusing as well, and it's regional and it's age-based. I grew up in New England, and when I was growing up, we used the term wicked a lot. Sometimes it was actually used to mean pure evil, like Darth Vader is wicked. Sometimes it just meant very, like, oh man, it's wicked cold outside. And sometimes it could mean excellent. That car is wicked. I grew up with it, and so for me, it was basically my first language. So it made perfect sense. But then when I was a little bit older, the slang shifted, and people started using sick. And sick could mean you have a cold. It could mean disgusting. Ew, that's sick. Or it could mean something that is over the top, really cool and excellent. Oh man, that was sick. So one term could mean a whole bunch of different things, and it was not part of what felt like my first language, so it got confusing. And slang is ever evolving. The slang that people grew up with seems so obvious to them because they've always had it. But to other people, it can be a mystery. I happen to live in a house with 2 teenagers, and I have to ask constantly what something means because slang is new, and what makes sense to me doesn't necessarily make sense to them, and vice versa. On top of slang, there are now abbreviations that used to only be used in text, but people are using them in real verbal conversations now, like YOLO, FOMO, WTF. It's pretty confusing. And the more important a conversation is, the less jargon and the less slang you should use. If it's a personal conversation and it's an important topic or a potentially heated one, slang can cause some serious misunderstandings, especially when it's between people of different generations. So try not to use it, and if the other person does use it, feel free to ask what it means. Always stop and ask if you're not sure what something means. At work, when you're dealing with people of your own industry, it can seem safe to use the quote-unquote common jargon. But I'll warn you, when I was doing the research, I was looking up the definitions of some of the business jargon I used, and I didn't agree with the definitions. So I looked elsewhere, and there were different interpretations. So I could find multiple interpretations for terms that seem pretty common within corporate America. So when you're using jargon, you may save a few seconds in that first conversation, but you may have a miscommunication, and it's going to take you way longer to resolve that than if you had just slowed down and made sure everything was understood in the first place. So even with your peers at work, use the inverse proportion rule. The more important it is, the less jargon you should use. As mentioned, next week's guest is Anna Xavier. And just a quick note about her, she's a podcast coach who speaks 4 languages, and she is so good at what she does. After our interview, we had a short conversation about podcasting. She gave me some information that I was able to implement right away. I've made changes that are beneficial from just a really quick conversation with her. I really appreciate it. I think she's fantastic. So if you are thinking about starting your own podcast, I'd recommend listening to The Podcast Space, which is her podcast. But if you're not, just check out next week's podcast and hear what she has to say about communication. Until then, have yourself a great week. Thanks for listening to another episode of How to Talk to Weirdos. Hopefully you found it both interesting and useful. If either of those things is true, please share. Do you have a friend or a coworker who could benefit from listening? Maybe a family member you're going to be spending the holidays with? please send them a link to your favorite episode and see if your conversations don't get just a little bit easier. I would really appreciate it. Thank you so much and have a great week.